The first ray of dawn pierced through the reinforced windows of what had once been Millbrook Elementary School, casting long shadows across the makeshift barricades that now served as humanity's last bastion in the forgotten town of Cedar Hollow. Zephyr Blackwood pressed her weathered palm against the cold glass, watching the morning mist rise from the playground where swings hung motionless, their chains rusted with 3 years of neglect. Below, scattered across the asphalt, dark stains marked where the infected had fallen during last month's breach, a grim reminder that safety was always temporary in this new world. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the hallway behind her, but Zephyr didn't turn. She had learned to distinguish between the purposeful steps of the living and the erratic stumbling of the infected. These footsteps belonged to Thessaly Moreau, whose soft-soled boots made barely a whisper as she approached. The former pediatric surgeon had adapted to their new reality with the same precision she had once used to save children's lives, though now her patients were fewer and her tools more primitive. "Any movement out there?" Thessaly asked, joining Zephyr at the window. Her voice carried the familiar exhaustion that had become the soundtrack of their existence. Dark circles beneath her amber eyes spoke of another sleepless night spent tending to Selim's fever, the result of an infected scratch he'd received during their last supply run. Zephyr shook her head, auburn hair catching the morning light. "Nothing yet. But they're out there. They're always out there." She gestured toward the tree line beyond the playground, where the forest created a natural barrier between their sanctuary and the ruins of the town center. 3 years ago, Cedar Hollow had been home to 8,000 people. Now, 14 souls remained in the school, and even that number felt like a miracle. The infection had started in the major cities, spreading faster than wildfire through crowded streets and subway systems. The media called them zombies, though the survivors had stopped using that word long ago. These creatures retained fragments of memory, sometimes standing motionless for hours in places that had once held meaning. A mother infected while grocery shopping would return repeatedly to the cereal aisle, a businessman would shamble endlessly through the ruins of his office building. They were driven by something more complex than simple hunger, something that made them infinitely more dangerous. "Indira's already up," Thessaly said, nodding toward the cafeteria where the sound of metal striking stone rang out in steady rhythm. The former civil engineer had been working since before dawn, reinforcing the foundation of their food storage area. Her determination to build something permanent in this temporary world had kept them alive more than once. "She thinks she can have the new water filtration system operational by noon." Zephyr felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. Hope was a dangerous commodity these days, but Indira's unwavering belief in tomorrow had become the cornerstone of their small community. The woman approached every problem as if they had unlimited time and resources, sketching plans for expansions and improvements that would take months to complete. Perhaps that stubborn optimism was exactly what they needed. The school's PA system crackled to life, Lysander's gravelly voice filling the empty corridors. "Morning assembly in 10 minutes. Everyone to the library." The announcement was brief, but Zephyr caught the underlying tension. Lysander had been a high school principal before the outbreak, and his ability to read people had only sharpened during their struggle for survival. If he was calling an early meeting, something significant had happened during the night. Thessaly and Zephyr exchanged glances before heading toward the library, their footsteps joining the growing chorus of movement throughout the building. They passed the gymnasium where Serafina and Orion slept, the teenage siblings who had arrived 6 months ago with haunted eyes and stories of settlements that had fallen to the infected. The younger generation adapted faster to this world, but they also carried scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. As they entered the library, Zephyr noticed that Vesper was already seated at the large oak table that served as their council forum, her laptop open and connected to the radio equipment they used to monitor emergency frequencies. The former crisis management consultant had maintained her professional demeanor even as the world crumbled around them, treating each day as another problem to be solved rather than survived. The morning sun now filled the library completely, illuminating the faces of the people who had become more than friends. They were family forged by necessity and strengthened by shared loss. But as Zephyr looked around the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this day would test that bond in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Lysander cleared his throat, commanding attention without raising his voice, a skill honed through decades of managing teenagers that served him well in managing survivors. His silver beard caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent planning their next moves. Vesper picked up something on the emergency channels around 3 this morning, he began, his tone measured but serious. There's a group calling themselves the Harbor Point Coalition broadcasting from the coast, about 40 miles northeast. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of Indira's hammer, which continued its rhythmic work in the cafeteria. Vesper leaned forward, her fingers dancing across the laptop's keyboard as she pulled up the transmission logs. They're claiming to have established a safe zone in an old Coast Guard station. Population of nearly 200, with sustainable food production and medical facilities. She paused, her dark eyes scanning the faces around the table. They're requesting contact with other survivor groups. Selim shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the bandage on his left arm visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. The former park ranger had been their primary scout since the early days, his knowledge of the local terrain invaluable for navigation and resource gathering. 200 people, he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. That's more than we've seen in one place since. Since the Pittsburgh safe zone fell, Serafina finished quietly. At 17, she possessed a sharp intelligence that often caught the adults off guard. Her brother Orion, barely 15, nodded gravely beside her. They had witnessed the collapse of 3 different settlements before finding refuge at the school, and their experiences had taught them to view hope with cautious reservation. Thessaly moved to examine Selim's bandage, her medical instincts overriding the conversation temporarily. "How's the pain level this morning?" she asked, gently probing the edges of the wound. The scratch was healing well, showing no signs of the telltale discoloration that preceded infection. Still, they all knew that the distinction between a simple injury and a death sentence could change in hours. "Manageable," Selim replied, though Zephyr noticed the slight tremor in his hands. Whether from pain or fever, she couldn't tell, but the sight filled her with the familiar dread that accompanied any sign of illness in their group. They had lost 3 people to infections that would have been easily treatable in the old world, minor cuts that became septic, illnesses that required antibiotics they no longer possessed. Lysander continued the briefing while Thessaly worked. "The coalition is asking for a representative meeting. Neutral ground, midway point. They want to discuss resource sharing and mutual aid agreements." He gestured toward the map that Vesper had spread across the table, marking locations with colored pins. "The meeting point they suggested is here, at the old ranger station in Millbrook State Park." Zephyr studied the map, her mind automatically calculating distances and risks. The state park was 15 miles from their current location, through terrain that could hide infected in countless valleys and tree stands. More concerning was the question of motivation. Why would a group of 200 people need allies if they were truly as secure as they claimed? It could be legitimate, Orion offered hesitantly. The teenager had developed an uncanny ability to repair and modify their electronic equipment, often picking up transmissions that others missed. "I've been monitoring their frequency for the past few hours. They're broadcasting regular status updates, maintenance schedules, even weather reports. That suggests organization and stability." Vesper nodded in agreement. "The transmission protocols are consistent with military or Coast Guard procedures. If they really have taken over a functioning facility, they might have access to resources we can only dream of: fuel, medical supplies, weapons." The sound of Indira's hammer had stopped, and moments later, she appeared in the library doorway, her work clothes dusty with concrete powder. The stocky woman wiped her hands on a towel before approaching the table. "Water systems operational," she announced with satisfaction. "And I couldn't help but overhear." "Are we talking about making contact with outsiders?" "Potentially," Zephyr replied. "But you know the risks as well as anyone." They had encountered other survivor groups before, and the meetings had rarely ended well. Desperation made people dangerous, and resources were always scarce enough to justify violence in the minds of those who had already lost everything. Indira studied the map for a long moment before speaking. From an engineering standpoint, an alliance makes sense. We have established infrastructure here, but limited manufacturing capability. If they have coastal access, they might have fishing vessels, solar panels from beachfront properties, maybe even a working radio tower. The practical benefits were undeniable, but Zephyr found herself thinking of the children they protected, not just Serafina and Orion, but the handful of younger survivors they had rescued over the years. Their current arrangement was far from perfect, but it was stable. Everyone knew their role, understood the risks, and trusted each other completely. Introducing variables into that equation could prove catastrophic. "We need more information before we commit to anything," she said finally. "If this coalition is real and they're as well established as they claim, they'll understand our caution. And if they're not..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but everyone understood the implication. Thessaly finished examining Selim's wound and returned to her seat. "I vote we send a small reconnaissance team first. Someone who can observe the meeting location and assess the situation before we reveal our full capabilities." The discussion continued as morning turned toward midday, each person contributing their expertise and concerns to the developing plan. Outside, the infected remained hidden in the shadows of the forest, but their presence was a constant weight on every decision. In this new world, survival meant balancing hope against caution, community against security, and the future against the very real dangers of today. By noon, the autumn sun had burned away the morning mist, revealing movement in the distant tree line that made Zephyr's stomach clench with familiar dread. She stood at the second-floor window of what had once been the principal's office, binoculars pressed to her eyes as she counted shapes moving between the pine trees. "Lysander," she called softly, not wanting to alarm the others unnecessarily. "We have visitors." The former principal joined her at the window, accepting the binoculars with steady hands despite the concern that flickered across his weathered features. After 3 years of this routine, they had developed an almost telepathic communication about threats. He watched for several minutes before lowering the binoculars. 15, maybe 20. "They're not moving with their usual pattern though." Zephyr nodded grimly. The infected typically wandered aimlessly unless attracted by noise or movement, but this group was moving with purpose, not quite the coordinated behavior they had witnessed in the early days of the outbreak, but something more intentional than random shambling. "Think they're being drawn by something?" "Or driven," Lysander replied, a new tension entering his voice. They had encountered other survivor groups who used the infected as weapons, herding them toward settlements they wanted to raid or abandon. The practice was horrifically effective and nearly impossible to defend against. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Vesper's arrival, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a troubled expression on her face. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "I've been monitoring the coalition's frequency, and their last transmission was concerning." She opened the laptop and played a recording through the small speakers. The voice was male, tense with barely controlled panic. "Harbor Point Coalition to all stations, we have multiple breach points in sectors 7 and 9. Requesting immediate assistance from any available units. Repeat, we are under attack and require." The transmission dissolved into static, then silence. Zephyr felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders. As the unofficial leader of their group, she had learned that survival often meant making choices with incomplete information and living with the consequences. "When was this transmitted?" 47 minutes ago, Vesper replied. "I've been trying to raise them since, but nothing. Either their radio equipment has been damaged, or..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Selim appeared in the doorway, his face pale but alert. Despite Thessaly's medical attention, the infection scratch was clearly taking its toll on his strength. "The movement in the forest, it's not random. They're being herded toward us by something or someone." The pieces clicked together in Zephyr's mind with horrible clarity. The Harbor Point Coalition wasn't requesting a meeting for mutual aid, she said slowly. They were scouting us. Finding out our location, our numbers, our capabilities. Lysander's jaw tightened. And now they're driving the infected toward us while they're under attack themselves. Classic desperation move. If they can't have our resources, they'll make sure no one can. The sound of running feet echoed through the hallway as Serafina burst into the office, her usually composed demeanor shattered by urgency. Indira says the infected are approaching from the north and east now too. We're looking at a three-front advance. She paused to catch her breath. And there's something else. Orion picked up radio chatter on a military frequency. Someone's coordinating this. Vesper's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up topographical maps and overlaying them with their known positions. If they're pushing infected groups from multiple directions simultaneously, this isn't opportunistic raiding. This is a calculated assault designed to force us into specific response patterns. Zephyr moved to the window again, this time focusing on the more distant hills where movement suggested additional infected groups converging on their location. The school's position had always been both an advantage and a liability, elevated enough to provide good visibility and defensive positions, but isolated enough to make escape difficult if they were surrounded. How long do we have? She asked Serafina. Indira estimates 40 minutes before the fastest group reaches our perimeter. Maybe an hour before they're all here. The teenager's voice was steady, but Zephyr could see the fear in her eyes. At 17, Serafina had already survived more horror than most people experienced in a lifetime, but the prospect of facing coordinated assault clearly shook her. Thessaly appeared in the doorway, medical bag in hand and determination written across her features. Selim shouldn't be involved in any defensive action given his condition, but he can coordinate from the communication center. I've prepared emergency medical supplies and positioned them in 3 locations throughout the building. The weight of leadership pressed down on Zephyr as she considered their options. They could attempt to break through the infected lines and flee to one of their predetermined safe houses, but that would mean abandoning 3 years of infrastructure development and stored supplies. They could fortify their position and attempt to outlast the assault, but without knowing who was orchestrating the attack or what resources they commanded, that could prove suicidal. There's a third option, Indira announced from the doorway, her work clothes exchanged for tactical gear that had seen better days. The water tunnels I've been reinforcing lead to the old storm drain system. It's not ideal, but it could provide an escape route that bypasses the infected entirely. Orion pushed past his sister into the crowded office, a handheld radio crackling with intercepted communications. The military frequency is going crazy, he reported breathlessly. Whoever's running this operation, they're talking about asset recovery and site clearance. They're not just trying to drive us away, they want to occupy this location. The realization hit Zephyr like a physical blow. The school's position, its defensible location and existing infrastructure, made it valuable to any group trying to establish permanent settlement. The Harbor Point Coalition hadn't been destroyed by infected, they had been looking for a new home, and their supposed distress call had been a cover for reconnaissance. How long until the tunnels are ready for evacuation? She asked Indira. 20 minutes to clear the debris I've been using to seal them. Another 10 to establish a safe path to the storm drain exit. Indira's practical mind was already working through the logistics. But we'll have to leave most of our supplies behind. The infected were closing in, unknown enemies were coordinating the assault, and their safe haven of 3 years was about to become a battlefield. Zephyr looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family, knowing that the decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see tomorrow. The decision crystallized in Zephyr's mind with painful clarity: they would split into 2 groups. Thessaly, take Serafina, Orion, and anyone who can't fight down to the tunnels with Indira. Get them to safety first. She turned to Selim, whose fever-bright eyes still held the sharp intelligence that made him their best tactical thinker despite his injury. Can you coordinate a delaying action from the communications center? Selim nodded, though the movement seemed to cost him considerable effort. 20 minutes should be enough to make our attackers think twice about occupying this place. I can rig some of our emergency supplies to create complications for anyone who tries to settle here after we're gone. Vesper closed her laptop with a decisive snap. I'm staying with the defensive team. My crisis management experience includes coordinating evacuations under fire. Her voice carried the professional calm that had served her well in corporate boardrooms and would hopefully serve them better in combat. Someone needs to maintain communication between the two groups. Lysander moved to the window again, studying the approaching infected with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent 40 years managing unpredictable situations. The beauty of using infected as weapons is that they're extremely difficult to control with precision. Whoever's driving them toward us has probably lost detailed command already. Serafina stepped forward, her jaw set with the stubborn determination that reminded Zephyr painfully of herself at that age. I'm not running while others fight. I know these buildings better than anyone except Indira, and I'm a better shot than half the adults here. Your brother needs you alive more than we need another fighter, Zephyr replied firmly, though she understood the teenager's frustration. The bonds forged by survival created obligations that transcended normal family dynamics. Everyone protected everyone, but the young carried the additional burden of representing hope for the future. Orion looked up from his radio equipment, his usually quick fingers hesitating over the controls. There's something else. The military frequency, they're coordinating with aircraft. Not infected, not ground assault. They have helicopter support. The implication sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the approaching autumn. Helicopters meant resources far beyond what any survivor group should possess. It suggested government remnants, military units that had maintained operational capability, or corporate entities with access to aviation fuel and maintenance facilities. That changes everything, Vesper said quietly. If they have air support, the tunnels become even more critical. But it also means they might have thermal imaging, which could track our underground movement. Indira had been listening silently, her engineer's mind working through the new variables. The storm drain system connects to the old mining tunnels from the 19th century. Natural stone, deep enough to mask thermal signatures, with multiple exit points scattered across 20 square miles. She paused, considering. But once we're in there, we'll have no communication with the outside world for hours. The sound of distant groaning reached them through the windows. The infected had reached the outer perimeter of the school grounds. Zephyr could see them now without binoculars, shambling figures emerging from the tree line in groups of 3 and 4. Some moved with the typical mindless lurching of the newly infected, but others displayed the unsettling coordination that marked the long-term infected who retained fragments of their former intelligence. Decision time, Lysander announced, checking his watch. 15 minutes until they reached the building. Thessaly shouldered her medical bag and moved toward Selim, professional concern overriding tactical considerations. That scratch is showing early signs of systemic infection. Not the zombie virus, regular bacterial infection from lack of proper sterilization. She pressed a small bottle into his hands. Antibiotics. Take 2 now, 2 more in 4 hours if you're still alive. The casual mention of survival hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. They had all learned to speak of death as a practical consideration rather than an emotional catastrophe, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed them to function when every day brought new reasons for despair. Selim accepted the medication without protest, his pragmatic nature overriding any pride about accepting help. The communications center has an independent power supply that should last 18 hours. I can maintain radio contact with both groups until you're clear of the immediate area. Zephyr found herself memorizing faces, a habit she had developed during the early days when group composition changed frequently due to death and abandonment. Serafina's determined expression, Orion's worried concentration, Thessaly's professional calm, Indira's practical confidence, Vesper's controlled composure, Lysander's steady leadership, and Selim's fevered but focused intelligence. These people had become more than companions or allies. They were the family she had chosen and the family that had chosen her in return. Indira, take your team and start clearing the tunnels. Radio silence until you reach the first waypoint. She turned to the others. Everyone else, we buy them time and then follow. Standard evacuation protocol, no heroes, no unnecessary risks. The infected were close enough now that individual faces were visible, a horrifying gallery of former humanity that included a woman in a nurse's uniform, a man still wearing the remnants of a business suit, and what had once been a child clutching a stuffed animal that was now more stain than toy. Each figure represented someone's mother, father, son, or daughter, transformed into a mindless threat by an infection that no one fully understood. As the two groups prepared to separate, Zephyr caught Seraphina's hand briefly. Take care of your brother. And remember, survival first, revenge never. We're better than the people attacking us because we choose to remain human. The teenager nodded solemnly, and for a moment, Zephyr saw not the hardened survivor that necessity had created, but the child that Seraphina should have been allowed to remain. Then the moment passed, replaced by the grim determination that had kept them all alive for 3 years in a world that seemed designed to kill hope itself. The first infected reached the school's main entrance just as Indira's team disappeared into the basement tunnel system, their footsteps fading into the darkness below. Zephyr positioned herself at the second-floor window with the rifle she had hoped never to use again, while Lysander and Vesper took positions covering the eastern and northern approaches. The silence before combat felt different this time, heavier, more final, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Selim's voice crackled through their handheld radios from the communication center. I count 67 infected on the grounds now, with more arriving from the forest every few minutes. Still no visual on human hostiles, but the helicopter noise is getting closer. The infected moved with disturbing purpose toward the building's entrances, their behavior confirming Zephyr's suspicion that they were being guided rather than simply following random attraction. Some attempted to break through the reinforced doors while others shambled around the perimeter, testing windows and probing for weaknesses with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. Southwest corner, 3rd floor, Vesper's voice reported through the radio. I can see armed figures positioned in the tree line. At least 4, possibly more. They're maintaining distance and observing rather than attacking. Zephyr adjusted her scope to scan the indicated area, catching glimpses of movement that suggested coordinated human presence. The attackers were using the infected as advanced scouts, letting them test the school's defenses while remaining safely out of range. It was a cold-blooded tactic that spoke of military training and moral flexibility. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the first floor as several infected managed to smash through a window in what had once been the kindergarten classroom. Their groans and shuffling footsteps filled the hallway below, joined by the occasional crash of furniture being overturned in their mindless search for human prey. Time to go, Lysander announced, firing a controlled burst from his position that dropped 2 infected attempting to breach the main stairwell. Whatever point we were supposed to prove, I think we've made it. Zephyr took one last look through her scope, memorizing the positions of the human attackers for future reference. Then she slung the rifle across her back and followed the others toward the route that would take them to the tunnel entrance. Behind them, the infected poured into the building like water filling a sinking ship, their cries echoing through hallways that had once rung with children's laughter. The basement corridor felt like descending into another world, the sounds of combat faded above them, replaced by the drip of water and the echo of their own breathing. Indira had left emergency lighting along the path, battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on concrete walls carved from the hillside decades earlier. Selim, status report, Zephyr spoke into her radio as they reached the tunnel entrance. Buildings compromised on the 1st floor, but I'm still secure up here. The human attackers have moved closer, I count 8 now, all armed with military-grade equipment. His voice carried the strain of fever and exhaustion. And Zephyr? That helicopter isn't just surveillance. It's carrying external equipment that looks like it could be some kind of electronic jamming device. The implications were clear, their attackers weren't just after the school for its strategic position. They had resources and coordination that suggested much larger organizational backing. This wasn't a desperate raid by starving survivors, it was a calculated operation by people who had maintained access to advanced equipment and training. The tunnel system stretched ahead of them, carved stone passages that smelled of earth and old water. Indira had done excellent work reinforcing the structure, but the ceiling was low enough that Lysander had to duck, and the narrow width meant they could only move single file. Behind them, the sound of infected exploring the basement grew louder. "Contact," Vesper announced quietly, her voice tense. "Motion ahead, approximately 50 meters." They froze, weapons raised, until a familiar voice called out softly, "It's Serafina. We're waiting at the first junction." Relief flooded through the group as they continued forward, finding Indira's team positioned at a widening in the tunnel where multiple passages branched off in different directions. "Any pursuit?" Indira asked immediately, her practical mind focused on immediate threats rather than emotional reunions. "Not yet, but it's coming," Zephyr replied. "The attackers know about the tunnel system, they're too well informed about our capabilities for this to be random." Orion looked up from a handheld device that was displaying some kind of technical readout. "I've been monitoring radio traffic. They're calling in additional resources, including ground teams with tracking equipment." He hesitated before continuing. "And they mentioned something about specimen recovery when they were discussing our group." The word sent a chill through the tunnel that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Specimen recovery suggested they weren't just being displaced, they were being hunted for reasons that went beyond territorial conflict or resource competition. "Move," Zephyr ordered, pushing down the growing dread. "Whatever they want with us, they're not getting it." The group pressed deeper into the tunnel system, their flashlights creating a small bubble of light in the pressing darkness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, not the shambling footsteps of infected, but the purposeful movement of trained individuals who knew how to navigate underground terrain. Thessaly stayed close to Selim, monitoring his condition as they moved. The fever was worsening, and the physical demands of rapid movement through difficult terrain were taking an obvious toll on his strength. But the former park ranger continued forward with grim determination, his knowledge of the area's geography invaluable for navigation. "Next junction, we split again," Indira announced, consulting a hand-drawn map by flashlight. "2 routes to the main mining chamber, then 3 separate exit points. Even with tracking equipment, they can't follow all of us." The helicopter noise was audible even through tons of rock and earth above them, its rhythmic beating seeming to follow their underground progress. Whoever was coordinating this operation had resources and planning capabilities that dwarfed anything the survivor groups had encountered before. As they reached the next junction, Zephyr made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, assuming she survived long enough to have a rest of her life. "Lysander, take Serafina and Orion through the eastern passage. Thessaly, go with Indira and Selim through the center route. Vesper and I will take the western passage and try to draw pursuit away from the others." The protest was immediate and came from multiple voices, but Zephyr cut them off with quiet authority. "This isn't a debate. We've survived 3 years by making smart tactical decisions, not sentimental ones." She looked at each face in turn, memorizing them again. "Rendezvous point is the old ranger station at Millbrook Falls. If anyone doesn't make it within 24 hours, the others move on." The farewells were brief, hurried, and heavy with the knowledge that some of them might be saying goodbye forever. Then the 3 groups separated into the darkness, carrying with them the hope that at least some portion of their makeshift family would survive to continue the work of rebuilding humanity in a world that seemed determined to prevent exactly that. The western passage sloped downward more steeply than the others, leading Zephyr and Vesper through a maze of natural stone formations that predated human civilization by millions of years. Their flashlights revealed ancient limestone walls streaked with mineral deposits that gleamed like frozen waterfalls in the darkness. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had grown more distant, suggesting their plan to draw attention away from the others was working. Vesper moved with surprising grace through the difficult terrain, her corporate background having apparently included more physical training than Zephyr had realized. According to Indira's map, this passage should connect to the old mining operation in about half a mile, she whispered, consulting the hand-drawn diagram by flashlight. But there's something I need to tell you about those radio intercepts. Zephyr paused, studying Vesper's expression in the dim light. The crisis management consultant had been holding back information, and given their current circumstances, that could prove fatal. What did you hear? The specimen recovery reference wasn't random, Vesper replied quietly. They mentioned specific individuals by name. Your name, specifically. And Thessalis. They're not just trying to clear us out, they're hunting particular people. The revelation sent ice through Zephyr's veins. Personal targeting suggested connections to the world before the outbreak, implications that reached back to lives they had tried to leave behind. What else? The organization coordinating this operation, they have resources that shouldn't exist anymore. Aviation fuel, maintained equipment, coordinated personnel across multiple states. Vesper's voice carried the analytical tone she had used in her corporate role, but underneath was genuine fear. This isn't a survivor group or even military remnants. This is something that was planned for and prepared to survive the collapse. They continued moving through the passage as Vesper spoke, their footsteps echoing softly off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human activity. The mining operations had been abandoned long before the outbreak, but evidence of previous human presence remained in the form of rusted equipment and carved initials dating back decades. Corporate conspiracy theories aside, Zephyr said carefully, we need to focus on immediate survival. Whatever these people want, they've demonstrated willingness to use infected as weapons to get it. A new sound reached them from behind, not the shambling of infected or the careful movement of human pursuit, but something mechanical. The distinctive whine of electric motors echoed through the stone passages, suggesting their hunters had access to equipment designed specifically for underground operations. Drones, Vesper identified immediately. Probably equipped with thermal imaging and low-light cameras. Running silent until now to avoid detection. Zephyr cursed under her breath. Drone surveillance in the tunnels meant their pursuers could track all three groups simultaneously while maintaining safe distance from any defensive action. The technology gap between the survivors and their attackers was becoming painfully apparent. They reached the mining chamber Indira had marked on her map, a vast underground space carved from living rock, with multiple entrances and a ceiling that disappeared beyond their flashlight range. Ancient mining equipment stood like metallic skeletons throughout the chamber, and the air carried the scent of mineral deposits and stagnant water. Movement, Vesper announced quietly, indicating one of the side passages. Multiple contacts, approaching from the northeast. Zephyr could hear them now, careful footsteps and the occasional whisper of equipment against stone. Professional soldiers or mercenaries, moving with practiced coordination through terrain they had clearly studied in advance. The drone surveillance explained their confident navigation of the underground maze. We need to reach one of the exit points, Zephyr whispered, consulting Indira's map. The nearest surface access is through that passage, but it means crossing open ground under potential observation. Before Vesper could respond, a new voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by some kind of portable speaker system and carrying the confident authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ms. Blackwood, Ms. Moreau, and the others. This is Colonel Harrison with the Restoration Initiative. We're here to offer you protection and medical care in exchange for cooperation with our research efforts. The formal announcement sent chills down Zephyr's spine. Government remnants with active operations meant resources and reach that could track them across continents if necessary. But it also meant bureaucracy, protocols, and potential negotiation opportunities that didn't exist with simple raiders. Your current situation is unsustainable, the voice continued. We know about Dr. Moreau's research into infection immunity, and we're aware of Ms. Blackwood's pre-outbreak work with the CDC. The knowledge you both possess is too valuable to lose to the wasteland. Vesper grabbed Zephyr's arm, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. Thessaly's not just a pediatric surgeon, she whispered urgently. And your background isn't just emergency management, is it? The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Thessaly's uncommon knowledge of infection protocols, her instinctive understanding of biological containment, her ability to recognize infection symptoms that others missed. Zephyr's own familiarity with disaster response coordination, her knowledge of government emergency procedures, her automatic authority in crisis situations. We were both working on the response team, Zephyr admitted quietly. Different agencies, different roles, but we were part of the initial investigation when the infection first appeared. We know things about its origin that we've never discussed with the others. The implications were staggering. If the Restoration Initiative was tracking former government personnel involved in the early outbreak response, they might be seeking answers to questions that had haunted the scientific community for 3 years. But they might also be seeking someone to blame for humanity's near extinction. 30 seconds to decide, Colonel Harrison's voice announced. Surrender voluntarily for medical evaluation and debriefing, or we continue this conversation under less pleasant circumstances. Around them, the sound of approaching personnel grew closer from multiple directions. The drone surveillance had allowed their hunters to position teams at every exit point while maintaining the illusion of choice. But Zephyr had spent 3 years learning that in this new world, there was always another option. It just usually involved accepting risks that rational people would reject. Follow me, she told Vesper, heading toward a section of the chamber where rusted mining equipment created natural cover. If they want us alive, they won't use explosives or heavy weapons. That gives us advantages they probably haven't considered. The next few minutes would determine whether their 3-year struggle for survival had been preparation for this moment, or simply a delay of an inevitable ending that had been planned from the beginning by people who viewed them as resources to be recovered rather than human beings to be protected. The abandoned mining equipment provided better cover than Zephyr had hoped. Massive steel structures that could stop small arms fire while offering multiple routes through the chamber. She led Vesper between towering ore processors and conveyor systems that had fallen silent decades before the outbreak, their movement masked by the echoing acoustics of the underground space. Contact left, Vesper whispered, pointing toward a team of 4 armed figures advancing through the chamber with military precision. Their equipment was indeed military-grade, complete with night vision gear and communication headsets that allowed coordinated movement without verbal commands. Zephyr counted at least 12 personnel visible in the chamber, with more likely positioned at exit points they couldn't see. The Restoration Initiative had committed significant resources to this operation, which suggested either desperate need for the information they possessed or confidence that the capture would yield proportional benefits. Dr. Blackwood, Colonel Harrison's voice echoed again, now with a tone of controlled impatience. We have your colleagues under surveillance at multiple locations. Continued resistance only endangers them unnecessarily. The threat was probably a bluff. Indira's tunnel routes had been chosen specifically to avoid predictable exit points, but the possibility that Thessaly, Seraphina, or the others might be captured made Zephyr's chest tighten with protective fury. 3 years of shared survival had created bonds stronger than blood family, and she would die before allowing them to become experimental subjects. A new sound reached them from above, helicopter rotors directly overhead, with mechanical noises that suggested equipment being lowered into the chamber. Within moments, additional personnel rappelled through the chamber's main shaft, cutting off their remaining escape routes with professional efficiency. Thermal imaging confirms 2 targets in the equipment section, a voice reported through the soldier's communication system, loud enough for Zephyr to overhear. No weapons visible, but treat as hostile until secured. Vesper touched Zephyr's shoulder, pointing toward a maintenance tunnel barely visible behind a massive ore crusher. The opening was narrow enough that it might have been overlooked in the soldier's initial reconnaissance, and it appeared to lead upward toward what could be an alternate surface access. Moving carefully through the shadows cast by their flashlights, they reached the tunnel entrance just as the first soldiers began systematic searching of the equipment area. The passage was cramped and obviously designed for maintenance access rather than human transportation, but it represented their only remaining option for avoiding capture. Movement in Maintenance Tunnel 7, a soldier reported as they entered the passage. Pursuing. The tunnel sloped upward at an angle that made movement difficult, with rough stone walls that scraped against their clothing and equipment. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was complicated by the confined space. Their hunters would have to move single file, which negated some of their numerical advantage. "This can't continue indefinitely," Vesper said quietly as they climbed through the darkness. "Even if we reach the surface, they have helicopter support and tracking equipment." Zephyr knew she was right, but surrender felt like abandoning not just their own lives but the safety of everyone who had trusted them with leadership. The knowledge they possessed about the early outbreak response might be valuable enough to keep them alive temporarily, but government agencies had demonstrated remarkable creativity in justifying extreme measures when national security was involved. The tunnel opened onto a natural cave system that showed signs of recent human activity: emergency supplies, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a camouflaged exit leading to the surface. Someone had prepared this location as a fallback position, though whether by their own people or their pursuers remained unclear. "Selim," Zephyr whispered into her radio, hoping the communication center's equipment could still reach them through the rock and earth. "Status report." Static answered her for several seconds before his fever-strained voice came through clearly. "They evacuated me from the school 20 minutes ago. Currently in their medical facility receiving treatment for the infection." There was a pause. "Zephyr, they're not what we thought. The Restoration Initiative, they've been tracking immune individuals across the entire continent." The implication hit like a physical blow. Immune individuals weren't just valuable for their knowledge, they were invaluable for their blood, their tissue, their potential contribution to vaccine development or infection prevention research. The 3 years they had spent believing themselves lucky survivors had actually marked them as precious resources in a world where immunity was rarer than gold. "Thessaly's preliminary blood work shows markers consistent with natural immunity," Selim continued, his voice growing weaker. "Mine too. They think our entire group might carry genetic factors that protected us from infection." Vesper stared at Zephyr with dawning horror. "They're not hunting us for what we know about the outbreak. They're hunting us for what we are." She gestured toward the communication equipment in the cave. "This isn't a fallback position we prepared, it's a trap they set up after studying our movement patterns." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder overhead, and through the camouflaged exit, Zephyr could see armed figures positioning themselves around the cave entrance. The systematic nature of their capture was becoming clear. Every route they had chosen, every decision they had made, had been anticipated and prepared for by people with resources and information far beyond what any survivor group should possess. "Colonel Harrison to cave occupants," the amplified voice announced from outside. "Dr. Blackwood and Ms. Vesper, you're surrounded by personnel equipped for non-lethal capture. We have your colleagues in protective custody, and we're prepared to offer medical care and research opportunities that could help prevent future outbreaks." Zephyr looked at Vesper, seeing her own resignation reflected in the other woman's eyes. 3 years of fighting for survival had ended not with zombie bites or raider bullets, but with the discovery that they had never really escaped the world they thought had ended. The government, or some portion of it, had been watching and planning and waiting for the right moment to reclaim assets it considered too valuable to lose. The autumn morning light filtering through the cave entrance carried the scent of changing seasons and the promise of winter's approach, a reminder that the world continued its ancient cycles regardless of human struggles for survival or freedom. Zephyr sat against the stone wall, watching Vesper methodically destroy the communication equipment to prevent it from being used to track other survivor groups. Their 3 years of freedom were ending, but they could still protect the people who remained hidden. "Dr. Blackwood," Colonel Harrison called from outside, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to waiting for desired outcomes. "We've received confirmation that your colleagues are responding well to medical treatment. Dr. Moreau's preliminary research notes are quite fascinating. Her observations about infection resistance patterns could accelerate vaccine development by months or years." The revelation that Thessaly had been conducting secret research stung, but Zephyr understood the necessity. In a world where hope was rationed more carefully than food, pursuing potential solutions in isolation protected the group from the crushing disappointment that had destroyed other settlements when promising leads proved futile. "They're offering something that sounds almost reasonable," Vesper observed quietly, finishing her destruction of the radio equipment. "Medical care, research facilities, the possibility of actually contributing to a solution instead of just surviving day by day." Zephyr nodded, though she couldn't shake the memory of government facilities from her pre-outbreak work, sterile environments where human beings became data points and individual autonomy disappeared beneath institutional necessity. "The question is whether we can trust them to maintain that reasonableness once they have what they want." Through the cave entrance, she could see personnel in clean military uniforms carrying medical equipment rather than weapons. The Restoration Initiative had clearly planned this operation as a recovery mission rather than a combat engagement, which suggested either genuine benevolent intentions or sophisticated understanding of how to manage valuable assets. 15 minutes, Colonel Harrison announced. "After that, we begin using non-lethal suppression methods to ensure your safety during extraction." Vesper laughed bitterly at the euphemism. "Non-lethal suppression methods to ensure our safety. At least they're maintaining the pretense that this is for our benefit." The sound of approaching footsteps in the maintenance tunnel behind them announced the arrival of the soldiers who had been pursuing them through the underground passages. Their escape routes were gone, their communication equipment destroyed, and their colleagues already in custody. The logical conclusion was surrender, but 3 years of survival had taught them both that logic was often less important than instinct. "There's one thing they haven't considered," Zephyr said suddenly, remembering something Selim had mentioned during their tactical planning sessions. "The old mining operations connected to natural gas deposits. Indira mentioned it when she was discussing structural reinforcement." Vesper stared at her with dawning understanding. "You're talking about bringing down the entire cave system. That's not escape, that's suicide." "Maybe. Or maybe it's ensuring that whatever immunity we carry dies with us instead of being used to create a vaccine that only the powerful can access." Zephyr gestured toward the equipment the soldiers carried, the helicopters overhead, the coordinated resources that suggested vast organizational backing. "This isn't about saving humanity. This is about controlling the tools for saving humanity." The ethical complexity of the decision pressed down on them like the weight of stone above. Their immunity could potentially save millions of lives if it led to effective treatment or prevention. But it could also become a tool for maintaining power structures that had contributed to civilization's collapse in the first place. "Dr. Blackwood, we're beginning extraction procedures," Colonel Harrison announced. "Please remain calm and follow instructions from our medical personnel." Soldiers emerged from the maintenance tunnel, their movements careful and non-threatening despite the weapons they carried. Their body language suggested training in dealing with traumatized civilians rather than hostile combatants, another indication that the Restoration Initiative viewed them as valuable resources requiring delicate handling. "Wait," Zephyr called out, raising her hands in apparent surrender. "If we cooperate, what guarantees do we have about our colleagues' treatment?" "Full medical care, comfortable accommodations, and meaningful participation in research that could prevent future outbreaks," Harrison replied immediately. The Restoration Initiative was established specifically to preserve crucial human resources during the recovery period. The phrase, human resources, crystallized everything Zephyr had feared about their situation. They weren't being rescued, they were being reclaimed as government property that had been temporarily misplaced during the chaos of societal collapse. As the soldiers approached with medical restraints disguised as safety equipment, Zephyr caught Vesper's eye and saw understanding pass between them. 3 years of shared survival had created communication that transcended words, and Vesper's slight nod indicated agreement with a decision they hadn't needed to discuss aloud. "I need you to understand something, Colonel," Zephyr said, standing slowly with her hands visible. "We've learned things during our time in the wasteland that go beyond immunity or infection research." "I'm sure you have," Harrison replied, his tone carrying the dismissive patience of someone humoring a valuable but confused asset. "Our debriefing teams are prepared to catalog all relevant information. We learned that survival isn't about staying alive at any cost," Zephyr continued, moving toward what she hoped was the right location based on Indira's geological observations. Sometimes it's about choosing what kind of future you're willing to create. The realization of her intentions dawned on the soldiers just as she reached the emergency flare she had spotted in the cave's supply cache. The natural gas deposits Selim had mentioned would require only a small ignition source, and 3 years of dangerous living had taught her to recognize the chemical scent that indicated combustible materials. As the flare ignited and the world dissolved into light and sound, Zephyr's last coherent thought was of Seraphina and Orion, hopefully still free in the tunnels below, carrying forward not just their immunity but their choice to remain human in a world that seemed determined to reduce people to their component parts. The cave system collapsed with a roar that echoed across the hills, taking with it not just 2 immune individuals but the knowledge they carried and the choice they had made to value freedom over survival. In the settlement that would eventually grow around the Restoration Initiative's research facility, their sacrifice would be recorded as a tragic loss of valuable resources. But in the hidden communities of survivors scattered across the wasteland, the story would be told differently, as a reminder that some things were worth dying for, and that hope sometimes required accepting endings rather than compromising beginnings. Miles away, Seraphina and Orion emerged from a storm drain into the autumn sunlight, carrying nothing but their memories and their choice to continue the work of rebuilding civilization one careful decision at a time. The world was still broken, still dangerous, still full of infected and those who would exploit them. But it also remained full of people willing to choose humanity over mere survival, even when that choice came at the ultimate cost.